Max Baker-Hytch, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back, Miles.
You're welcome. It's lovely to see you. So, God's existence is not as obvious as it could be. I recently spoke with Richard Carrier, and he made the point that if Jesus really did rise from the dead, for example, he
Yeah,
could have appeared to anyone. He could have
sure.
appeared to each and every one of us from 2,000 years ago to the present day. If he really is God, he absolutely had that power. And yet, the
Yeah.
historical accounts indicate that if all of this really did happen, it was really just a handful of people he appeared to briefly, which is kind of what you'd expect if it didn't actually happen, if it were a fabrication, a legend, a mythology, or what have you. So, in general, there is this problem of divine hiddenness that God's existence could have been a lot more evident. God could have made himself far more apparent than he evidently has. So
Mm.
I wanted to begin with the insight that Elon Musk, everybody's favorite person, offered once when talking with Joe Rogan about aliens, where he made this point that actually struck me quite powerfully that if aliens have visited Earth, they've been remarkably subtle about it. And I think that's right. I mean, his point, that the argument he's containing with that simple point is that if aliens really do exist, intelligent beings that have visited Earth, why have they been so subtle that most of us have never experienced an alien visitation? I mean, I think
Mm.
that's probably the best argument against aliens having visited Earth. And you might think, well, there's other evidence that outweighs it, whatever. Now, the question then is, analogously, why is God so subtle if in fact he exists? And isn't
Mm.
that a good reason to think that there is no God? So I realize I'm rambling here to get us to get the discussion framed, but I want to begin on a more personal note, Max. In your own personal religious life, have you ever been bothered by the relative absence of evidence for God's existence, or the just absence of the reality of God in your life? Does that ever make you step back and
Mm.
go, is this real? Is this actually the truth?
Yes, I would say I definitely do. I've certainly experienced doubts about the existence of God at times, and the argument from divine hiddenness is, I would say, right up there as what seems to me to be one of the toughest objections to theism and specifically Christianity.
Mm. And I guess what role does that play in your religious convictions? I mean, how bothered are you by this issue? Because, like, for me personally, I would say, in terms of like the arguments for God's existence or against God's existence, just the day to day fact that God is not a reality as evident to me as the
Yeah.
nose on my face or the people in my family or my friends, that is like a daily concern that I have,
Mm.
where I constantly step back and ask myself, but at least in an epistemic situation like that, where God is that distant, it does cause me pretty consistently to question whether or not it's true. I mean, would you say though that the level of your experience of God or your acquaintance with theistic arguments is such that no, it actually doesn't bother you to that degree?
Yeah, I think what you've described probably goes a bit beyond the way in which it bothers me. I think, I mean, you could say this is a mistake, but I think, I'm reconciled with the idea that, okay, God seems to have chosen to interact with humans in a mostly rather indirect way, and in a way that leaves a significant degree of ambiguity. And I can speculate, and I'm sure we might get into this about what the reasons might be for that. But I think what's clear is that it isn't. I think insofar as people want to talk about a relationship with God bearing an analogy to human relationships, I think that sort of analogy, if pressed too far, is going to really rub up against what you just described, because that's just
Yes.
not how it feels to most people. I would suggest, including most religious people.
Yes. Well, okay. let's get into the philosophical meat of the issue. The most discussed version of the problem of divine hiddenness in philosophy, anyway, has been
Hmm.
J.L. Schellenberg's argument from hiddenness. And he formulates it as follows, as a deductive argument. Premise one: if a perfectly loving God exists, then God is always open to a personal relationship with any human being. Two: if God is always open to a personal relationship with any human being, then no one possesses non resistant non belief in God. Three: therefore, if a perfectly loving God exists, then no one possesses non resistant non belief. Four: there is at least one person who is in a state of non resistant non belief. And five: therefore, perfectly loving God does not exist. So I think the first point to make is a clarificatory one, that non resistant non belief refers to non belief in God that one possesses through no fault
Right.
of one's own. So frequently, various religious folks will claim that this or that atheist is actively trying to deny God's existence. They don't want to live a life yielding to God's authority, for example. They want to live in sin, and so they resist arguments and evidence or the personal experience of God. That would, if true, would be an example of resistant non-belief. But Schellenberg is saying that in addition to that, however prevalent it might be, there is at least one case in all of the world of someone who just doesn't believe in God, but through no fault of their own. He points to people who exist in like pre-Christian or pre-theistic religious societies of the ancient world. You can think of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the various dynasties of ancient China. I mean, these individuals just didn't have a theistic concept in the first place. And so of course they don't believe in God, but it's not through some moral failing or resistance on their part. Or people in doubt currently who are earnestly seeking God but fail to find them. And then finally those in post-doubt, he calls those that find themselves in a secular society where belief in God just isn't really a live intellectual option. And so they don't particularly seek out to see if God exists, but neither do they do so with fairies or unicorns or Santa Claus. And so all of these individuals ostensibly have a non-resistant non-belief. So that's what he builds upon. Now, I didn't sketch the reasons for each premise, so I'm just going to invite you,
Yeah,
Max, my guest here, to expand upon the argument. If you want to go
absolutely.
through the crucial premises to me are one and two. So if
Yeah.
you want to speak to those, and
Well,
before you even talk about like what's wrong with them.
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, if I may, Miles, firstly, I mean, the way Schellenberg lays out the argument does bring out more explicitly why we get this sort of expectation for no non-resistant belief given theism. But I do think
Mm,
actually there is a sort of more succinct way to present the argument, which is really just a
okay.
two-premise deductive argument, which has what we could call an expectation premise and a non-resistant non-belief premise, right? So the
Okay.
expectation premise says if theism is true, then there should be no non-resistant non-belief whatsoever. And the non-resistant non-belief premise says there is at least one instance of non-resistant non-belief in human history. So yeah, I think
Yes.
yeah, in terms of the way you summarize Schellenberg's argument, is that the formulation from his 2015 book? Perhaps I know it's gone through slight variations over the years, but I think the core idea is the same. But yeah, I think
Yes.
the way we're supposed to get to that expectation of no non-resistant non-belief given theism is a combination of the idea that belief in the existence of God is a prerequisite for a personal relationship with God, combined with the idea that a perfectly loving God would want to offer every non-resistant individual a personal relationship at basically every waking moment of their life. Um, so yeah, I think it's a pretty intuitive argument to get a hold of. I think it's not super complicated. The as I said, the motivation for that, well, what I'm reducing down to one premise, that what I'm calling the
Yes.
expectation premise, is it's really something that we're supposed to be able to see to be true, just sort of a priori, as it were, without having to investigate what our world is like. We're supposed to be able to just see that a perfectly loving being, just by reflecting on what it means for a being to be perfectly loving, would just always want to hold out the offer of a relationship to any creature that it created that is sort of cognitively capable of that type of relationship, unless the creature actively resisted it. And the thought, which is also supposed to be a conceptual truth, that you can't have a personal relationship with someone unless you believe that that person exists. Okay, so yeah, then in terms of the empirical premise, the non-resistant non-belief premise, I think Schellenberg takes it that it's just very well. He offers a few different ways to motivate that premise, and which, by the way, I think is very plausible. So that there's been at least one non-resistant non-believer in all of human history, I think, is very plausible. And so one way is kind of what you just sketched. You can go through sort of different categories of human beings who seem to be especially good candidates for being non-resistant non-believers. The sort of pre-Christian or pre-axial humans. I don't know that actually. I think that's the best case, because there are debates about the extent to which, for example, in ancient Chinese religion, there was a concept of a high god. So you might actually have something that scholars of religion would call henotheism. Yes, there's a belief in many gods, but there's one kind of high god who's above all of the rest, and that you might think that kind of closely enough approximates monotheistic belief that could be a sufficient basis for a relationship with a monotheistic God. But on the other hand, I do think that cases of people who grew up in, let's say, East Germany under Soviet communism, that does look like a good case where people really were systematically just exposed to a belief system that excluded God. And so, it kind of looks hard to see how someone who's just been soaked in that from birth could be at fault for not believing that God exists. So I suppose Schellenberg is also asking theists to think about their kind of non-theist counterparts who they've interacted with in life, and think about the people you've interacted with on the other side of the aisle on the issue, who seem to be just as virtuous, just as conscientious as yourself, and ask yourself, do you really think it's plausible that their failure to believe that God exists is due to some fault on their part, or even, and I have a paper on why it's an unpromising strategy for theists to argue that there are no non-resistant non-believers. It's called on sin-based responses to divine hiddenness in the journal Religious Studies. Right. And so I basically say there that one reason it's going to be a real uphill battle to try and deny that there are any non-resistant non-believers is that you have to think of it comparatively, because after all, theists are human beings with moral character flaws. And so you kind of are going to have to say the least virtuous, the least sort of epistemically and morally virtuous theist is, in the relevant respects, nonetheless more virtuous than the most virtuous, most epistemically and morally virtuous non-theist. And that seems like quite a tough bullet to bite.
I agree with you, but I think you'd agree that, like, the most common pastoral response to the problem of divine hiddenness, if they're ever presented with this philosophically sophisticated issue, and maybe the low-level Christian apologist or just the layman's initial response, is going to be to point to the verse in Romans where the Apostle Paul says something along the lines of that. Oh no! Wait,
Yeah.
what am I thinking of? Oh no, I'm thinking of a passage in Psalms. That's right.
Okay.
And I'll keep that in so that I'm human and imperfect. But that the verse in Psalms where he says, "The fool in his heart says that there is no God. And I think what I'm getting at with Romans is the first few chapters of the book of Romans seems to indicate that Paul thinks of people as suppressing the truth about belief in God, and that's when they give themselves to sin and so on and so
Sure.
forth. So there does seem to be this undercurrent that, like, there are no real atheists, right? Or at least there are none that haven't gotten there except through repressing things in a morally culpable way.
Yes.
And I mean, even I'll just say
Sure.
one more point, that even as prominent a philosopher and apologist as William Lane Craig has said that unbelief in every case that at least endures till the end of life is culpable. And so that's in direct contradiction to the idea of non-resistant non-belief. Now, maybe he would qualify that and say there might be periods, finite periods of time in one's life where the non-belief is not culpable. It's just that if you endure in that state until at the end of your life, that actually it's your fault. So I wonder if you could say more here. Why are these Christians wrong?
Yeah. Okay. So on the biblical text you alluded to, the Romans, you're thinking of Romans 1, I think, where Paul talks about how God's attributes of power and
Yes.
wisdom are basically manifest for everyone to see,
Yes.
such that
Yes.
no one has an excuse. Now,
Yes. Yep. I knew it was in
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so now I think something that one could say about that is that Paul was so clearly Paul was reflecting on his Greco-Roman context in which there were arguably no atheists in our modern sense of the word, right? Atheism in our sense of sort of materialism or naturalism just wasn't a remotely live option for anyone, and so. Yeah, I think Paul was reflecting accurately on the situation for humanity in his time period when he says that. And I don't think one has to. Now, I understand that the Christians that you referred to who invoke that verse are thinking that Paul is making a statement about humanity across all
Yes.
periods of history. But I'm not convinced that one has to read it that way. And it seems to me that, okay, just for example, you know, the exposure to natural beauty, I think, and especially the night sky when you don't have to contend with light pollution like we have in our cities these days. I think that is I mean, empirically, I think this is borne out that exposure to that is going to incline you towards religious belief. And
Mm.
I suspect it's not a coincidence that people who live in densely populated urban areas where they never really encounter, natural landscapes, let alone the night sky, um, uh, find it just a lot more natural to kind of not think about the universe as having been created. And so it seems to me that there is that the conditions of human life in the 21st century are such that I mean and maybe this is in a sense due to humanity's behavior, but it's not due to like any one individual's behavior or attitude, that we are at a greater epistemic distance from God. I mean, there's lots of other reasons besides the example I gave, but I mean, you see what I'm getting at. That I think it's plausible that humanity now is, in some respects, at a greater epistemic distance from God than
Mm.
people were when the Apostle Paul was writing.
Okay. Okay. So the key move in that case is to reject the interpretation of Paul that says he's talking about everyone across time throughout the world, that God's existence is obvious to every single person. I mean, to me, that's undeniably false. Not the interpretation of Paul, but
Yeah,
just as a claim about the world, that's not true. And so we want to say that Paul is talking about a limited time period in history, namely his period in which he's
yeah.
writing, where it perhaps is more the case that natural beauty, for example, suggests a divine creator.
Yeah, no, and I said there's other factors too. I think Not also what the sociologist Peter Berger calls social plausibility structures. I mean, the we live in a secular age, right? In the sociological sense that a secular way of seeing the world is a very live option, and religious belief is just one option among others, and that's a very different situation from that of the ancient Greco-Roman world, where yes, there's different options, but they're all in some sense religious ones. And so, yeah, the social plausibility structures, the kind of fabric of social reality that makes certain options live and others not, is very different for us in the 21st century than it was in the first century.
I agree with you, and I think Schellenberg would say I second that,
He
and
would,
would use that as a
he would,
further argument for the empirical
yes,
premise.
he
So
would.
I think you, myself, and Schellenberg are all willing to grant that there are non-resistant non-believers. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so then it comes down to this conditional claim, as you've collapsed the two premises of the argument form that I stated into one, that if theism is true, if God exists, there is no non-resistant non-belief. So I get the intuition behind the argument. It's that a perfectly loving God would always be open to personal relationship with any human being. That's basically a quote from
Yeah.
Schellenberg. That just we can see the truth of that point just by reflecting upon what it means to be open to a personal relationship. You would do nothing to prevent the realization of that relationship. That if there is an obstacle to forming a relationship, it can only come from the other party, in this case, human beings. And so what Schellenberg is saying is that if God is the paradigm of love, then if anyone is ever not actively in relationship with God, and we might want to ask, well, what does relationship mean? Then it's because of them. They have actively resisted it. Whereas, so what follows from that is if they are not actively resisting it, then they will always be in relationship with God. And then the second point is that if God fails to make his existence clear to people, they cannot possibly be in relationship with God. No matter how willing
Yeah.
they might have been, if they don't believe God exists, they can't possibly
Yeah.
be in relationship to him. And so non-resistant non-belief, the lack of sufficient evidence to believe in God, is an obstacle to relationship with God that seemingly God would have to be the one that's putting in place in this case. But that
Mm.
contradicts what we've just stated about God's being perfectly loving. So that's
Yeah.
the chain of logic here. What is problematic about
Well, I
this
really like how you set that
intuition?
up because yeah, there's, as you said, that in a sense there's two kind of uh, intuitions that are coming together to support this expectation premise. So one is, yeah, a loving God always wants you to be able to have relationship with him insofar as you want that. Right. And then the second one is, the
Yes.
second intuition coming in there is that unless God gives you a certain amount of evidence, such that you're going to be able to have a kind of conscious, explicit belief that God exists, then you are just ruled out of being able to have a relationship with God. And so I think both of those intuitions should be questioned, even though I can see on the
Okay.
face of it that they have some plausibility. So yeah, shall we begin with the first one?
Yes, that if God is perfectly loving, then he's always open to relationship with any individual.
Yes,
Is
that's
that the
right. So
first?
I mean, okay, one thing here is that the way Schellenberg frames the argument is very very bold, and maybe that's good in philosophy. We like bold claims to interact with, but the thing is, he's there saying is that to put it in the language that philosophers like to use sometimes, that there is um, in every single possible world in which creatures like ourselves exist, there is not a single such creature who, for a single second of their existence, is without God's is not sort of in a position to enter into a relationship with God. This is how Schellenberg's saying things would be if God existed, and
Mm.
that's, I think,
In a possible world, Just
Yeah.
for the non-initiated, a possible world is just any way the world could have
Yes.
been, any possible description of reality as a whole. And so unicorns, we might say, exist in some possible world, but they don't exist in the actual world. It's just a way of talking about possibilities.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So the idea is like there's no way that reality could have been rearranged such that a creature, a conscious, sentient, cognitively capable creature like ourselves would ever be without the opportunity to have a relationship with God for even so much as a second of our existence
Yes.
in any possible world. And I think it's just worth reflecting on just how strong a claim that is. So I think, you know, uh, and you get a similar dynamic with the problem of evil when people like John Mackey were setting up the problem of evil in this way as well, saying, in effect, saying that there's no possible world where God would allow even the teensiest bit of suffering for even a nanosecond. And you can see then that it's not that difficult to refute such a claim by coming up with some mildly plausible greater good for the sake of which God would permit at least a tiny bit of suffering for a split second. Now, obviously, the situation in our world is such that there's far more than there's a huge amount of suffering, but that is to switch to a different way of looking at the problem in terms of the something about the amount of it or the kind or the way it's
Yes.
distributed. But Schellenberg, so I think that's just worth emphasizing. Schellenberg is setting up his argument as a kind of as you said, as a deductive argument that does have this premise that makes a very strong claim indeed, and all someone needs to do to refute that claim is to tell a story about a possible world. It doesn't have to resemble our world at all. A possible world in which God has a good reason to allow a creature to undergo some non-resistant belief for a minute, and that's all it would take to refute that claim, given the way he's set things up.
Okay. Okay. So what now? I guess it's important to distinguish responses to each step.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure I'm not losing sight of where we're at. The first premise of his statement of the argument is that if God exists, God is always open to a personal relationship with any human being. So are we still there?
We're still
or
there.
What you're about to suggest?
Okay. Let's stick with the way you set the argument out, because as I said, in my expectation premise sort of folded two premises into one. One is the one that you just read out, and the other is that you have to have this kind of explicit belief that God exists in order for a relationship with God to be possible.
Yes.
So we should definitely come on to that. But yeah, we're still on the bit about openness for a personal relationship.
Okay. So what are some possible reasons that God would be closed to a personal relationship?
Well, so there's a whole bunch that have been explored in the literature over the last 30 years. So there's things ranging from the thought that, well, absence makes the heart grow fonder, to put it in a sort of slogany form. So there's this whole tradition of thinking that kind of dark night of the soul, a state in which someone is longing for God's presence but doesn't get it, can actually ultimately lead to a deeper relationship with God, a greater appreciation for relationship with God when that does become possible. There's the thought that would be one. There's another thought would be that being in a state in which God's existence is ambiguous, is open to doubt, allows one to display certain kinds of virtues. So Robert Adams has explored this a bit, among other people. So the idea is that, that there's a certain kind of virtue in exercising trust in God amidst a situation in which God's existence is somewhat ambiguous. You kind of get to, so you almost have to sort of take a risk in a way. If you're staking your well-being on something for which you don't have absolutely decisive evidence, you're forced to sort of weigh up how much you actually care about this. Another thought might be that stronger revelation than we in fact have would result in our being coerced in some sense. So you kind of get that. Yeah, Soren Kierkegaard explored this a little bit in his philosophical fragments. So he kind of develops this extended parable about a king and a maiden that he's fallen in love with, and the problem is that he wants to marry her, but he realizes that because of the power imbalance between them, he's going to have to find some way of winning her over without her kind of realizing that he's the king. Obviously, it's an imperfect analogy, but I think what he's getting at there is that there's a sense in which the power imbalance between us and God risks sort of overwhelming us if God approaches us in a way that's just manifestly obvious, as opposed to a manner in which his existence is more subtle and open to doubt. So yeah, I mean, and I could go on, but those are some of the sorts of greater goods, as it were, that have been suggested as possible reasons why God might not always hold out the opportunity for, reasons why God might not be, evident to the degree which would mean that everyone believes that God exists.
So I think that with any purported greater good that the theist might appeal to as justification for God's distance or hiddenness, you have to ask two questions. The first is the good in question greater than the evil, in this case, the
Right.
hiddenness? And two, is the evil actually necessary for the attainment of that good? Now, I think I'm willing to grant an affirmative answer to the second question, that the goods you've appealed to really can only be realized in a world where there's some degree of distance between God and humans. What's not clear to me, and I think where Schellenberg would press, is that the goods you've mentioned are greater than the privation of a relationship with God. And so this is the point that Schellenberg actually makes explicitly as kind of a global response to greater good replies. He'll say, the greatest good that a human being is capable of is relationship with the infinite good, the infinite God. And that has some intuitive pull to be in relationship with the infinitely loving creator of all reality. That's the greatest good we're capable of experiencing or realizing. And so no other good can possibly outweigh removing that greatest good, just as kind of a basic point about the mathematics involved, if we think of it in terms of amounts. So what do you think of that response as an undercutting defeater of all of the examples you gave?
Sure. Thanks, Miles. So I suppose one could think the following, namely that, yes, relationship with God is an unsurpassable good, but that not just any old relationship with God is an unsurpassable good. So if you think that there's a certain set of attitudes or a certain manner in which one needs to have arrived at that relationship with God in order for it to be that kind of unsurpassable good for human flourishing. If you think that, rather than it just being like, so you could think, so suppose that I just really don't want a relationship with God, or perhaps it's also, suppose actually no, I do want a relationship with God, but not for very good reasons, like just because like I want him to kind of do stuff for me, and suppose that God appears to me like in a way that the Apostle Paul is reported to have had an appearance of the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, like just overwhelming, indubitable kind of experience. And so now I'm in a relationship with God, but it's a relationship that is based on these less than optimal. Like again, let's make it that I'm not a resistant individual in Schellenberg's sense. I want a relationship with God, but the kind of reasons I want it are a bit suboptimal. And so, is it clear that that is the greatest possible good for me? So I'm not sure it is. So I'm inclined towards the thought that these greater goods are bound up with the attainment of the best kind of relationship that we could have with God. Um, so, like, I mean, the first one I talked about, the kind of dark night of the soul, or absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think that the whole point of that is that there's a sort of purification effect that absence experience has on the person, such that they are, they come out of it with attitudes towards God that are going to make for a superior relationship to what they would have had before. And so yeah, you kind of see where I'm going with that. But then added to that, I think, is the issue of an afterlife, right? So if there is an afterlife in which I can have a sort of completely as it were, like unambiguous, unmediated opportunity for relationship with God forever. It's not. It becomes much less clear to me that missing out on relationship with God for a finite amount of time on earth is a hugely terrible evil that is going to be very difficult to overcome with the sorts of greater goods that I was sketching.
Yes. Yes. I think, however, too much reliance upon the point about an eternal life with God gets you involved in thorny questions and complex issues about the fate of everyone after death.
Well,
I mean, if we're approaching this as universalists, that's going to be one
yeah,
thing where we think everybody is saved,
yeah,
every
yeah.
single person ultimately has eternal life. I think you kind of exacerbate the problem
Well,
Schellenberg is
now
getting at if
you're
you say,
absolutely.
some people are
Yeah, yeah,
damned.
yeah. Now, yeah, you're absolutely right, and I talk about this in another paper that I published on hiddenness, on mutual epistemic dependence and demographic divine hiddenness. So that's a
Mm.
slightly older paper, but um,
Links to which will be in the
thank
description.
you. Sorry, I mean shamelessly plugging my papers,
No,
but
do.
yes. So let me put it like this: versions of theism which build into them the idea that everyone who dies in a state in which they have substantially incorrect theological beliefs is going to miss out on relationship with God forever. Those versions of theism, I would suggest, are strongly disconfirmed by the data of the data of non-resistant non-belief, that kind of thing, because that hypothesis strongly predicts that God would set the world up so that everyone has a very clear, unmissable, as it were, opportunity to have the correct set of theological beliefs within their earthly lifetime. And it just really looks like our world hasn't been set up in that way. So yeah, you're absolutely right to point out that it, this the move I made of appealing to the afterlife is whether that's very helpful is going to depend on is going to depend on exactly what sort of theistic story we're talking about here. But yeah, I'm not thinking about a version of theism that is what you could call hard exclusivist.
Yes. I think that any problems for exclusivism or a doctrine of eternal torment, those just layer on issues to the core problem that Schellenberg has pointed
Yes.
towards. So there are several fascinating avenues we can take, but let me ask you briefly, while I still have you, about the second step here. That if God is always open to personal relationship with everyone, then there is no non-resistant non-belief. That's the second step. of the second chain in his argument. And the predominant theistic responses to that second claim, I think, try to argue that you can still be in relationship with God, even if you don't believe that God
Mm.
exists, which initially is quite the provocative claim. And I found most defenses of it just beside the point and implausible. But before poisoning the well ahead of you, what do you make of this second step?
Well, yeah. So I think so. Firstly, I think we need to back up a bit and reckon with the fact that now you could say, well, this is just more grist to Schellenberg's mill. But the thing I'm going to say is that I think we need to reflect on the fact that even those with fully explicit, conscious theistic beliefs, Christian beliefs, even many or perhaps most such people, I think really don't take themselves to have a kind of interactive, chatty relationship of the sort that we are having right now, right? I think most religious believers of the description that I just sketched then would admit that it is a very subtle, indirect kind of thing, and you pray prayers, and you might spot certain patterns that you wonder whether they might be answers to those prayers. You experience certain emotions in response to certain kinds of religiously significant moments in life, but it's very different from, as I said, from this sort of typical human to human relationship. And so the reason I slightly belabor that point is just to say that we shouldn't think that there's this massive gulf between the kind of relationship that explicit theistic believers might be able to have with God in this lifetime versus people whose theological beliefs are substantially incorrect, given theism, that is. Do you see what I'm saying? So these ideas about people having belief in God without realizing that it's God that they're having, having relationship with God without realizing that it's God that they're having a relationship with. I do have some sympathy for those. But again, I can see why one would say, oh, that's like just so, whatever that relationship is just kind of so sort of suboptimal, it's not worth having. But again, I would just say, well, I don't actually think that it's going to be so different and so much less worth having than the type of relationship with God that most explicit theistic believers take themselves to have.
So I agree with you, but I'm not sure that that's actually helping you here dialectically, because I think Schellenberg would probably grant the point that these kind of halfway relationships that theistic philosophers will try to point to as instances of having a relationship with someone even when you don't believe positively that the person exists, that isn't terribly distant from the kinds of relationships that even the most earnest religious zealot would claim to have with God. I think Schellenberg would say, right, but that is, all of that taken together is inconsistent with the idea of a perfectly loving God. Like, God should have made it exactly like the conversation you and I are having. And what he would say is that that's a better kind of relationship than one that's
granted, right. So, but here's what I think we need to pay attention to, though, that if the main point is just that the very ambiguous sort of the sort of relationship I think most theists think they have with God, if that's kind of suboptimal, well, then that's kind of that's what Schellenberg's argument kind of is going to turn on. But if there are some good reasons for God to allow that kind of thing to go on with respect to explicit theistic believers, then I don't think here's the key point. I don't think it adds very much to Schellenberg's arsenal to invoke believe people with non-theistic beliefs who might be candidates for a sort of implicit relationship with God. I don't think it adds much to Schellenberg's arsenal to say, well, that's a really crummy kind of relationship. Insofar as it is crummy, that's going to be because it was already crummy in the case of the explicit theistic believers. So then we should just focus on that and whether there are good reasons for God to allow that situation to obtain.
Okay. Well, all right. What are some examples of the supposed implicit belief in God in this?
Yeah.
In this
well,
case?
So how might it work? Do you mean?
Right. I mean, I'm aware of Daniel Howard Schneider's points about de re versus de dicto belief, but I'm just like, what are you thinking of here? What is an example or a possible example of a relationship with God where one does not have explicit belief, or that is compatible with non-resistant
non-belief? So I think there's at least two sorts of cases we could think about. So one is where a person does have some kind of belief in supernatural agents, where now it's going to depend on the details of what sorts of characteristics they attribute to those agents, but it could be that the person is implicitly relating to the God of sort of traditional Abrahamic theism, let's suppose, on the hypothesis that kind of God exists. It could be that a person with some sort of polytheistic beliefs relates to the high God in their tradition, who has enough of a resemblance to the God of Abrahamic theism that it sort of there's enough resemblance that that could look plausible. Now, I suppose another case might be someone who doesn't have any obviously supernatural beliefs at all, but and I think we could think about the way in which we sort of engage with our moral obligations in life and as being implicit ways of relating to God. So someone who has a very profound sense of duty, it's almost as if they're acting as if the universe has a kind of claim on them, on their conscience, if you like. But they would absolutely disavow belief in any kind of supernatural agent. I do think that there might be a way in which we could think of them, the way in which they interact with their duty or the notion of the good, as kind of implicit ways of relating to God. And again, I would just stress, if that all sounds very sort of indirect and pretty sparse, I would just again emphasize the point that even in the sort of typical case of an explicit theistic believer, it's pretty sparse for a lot of people and pretty indirect. Those would be a couple of suggestions.
I guess my worry, dialectically speaking, is that it seems to collapse the strength of the theistic response from two independent responses just kind of back into one. If what we're saying is that, well, wait, let me think if I'm forming this thought correctly, because I might not be. I think my issue is that what you're saying is that, maybe these people have an implicit kind of relationship with God. And then Schellenberg would reply to that and say, but that's not the highest form of relationship that we are capable of. That a better relationship is one that's based on real and explicit belief, that brings about more value, like the one that you and I have here. And therefore, that if a perfectly loving God exists, he would always be open to that kind of explicit real relationship. And if he is, then there would be no non-resistant non-belief. And so then the counter-reply I think that you've offered is, well, theists themselves have never claimed that they experience that kind of really explicit, robust relationship. And I think Schellenberg, again, would just say, right. That itself is problematic from a theistic point of view. There shouldn't be that kind
Yeah,
of
but
suboptimal relationship.
sure. But so I take it though that the way in which bringing up the alleged poverty of implicit relationship with God is supposed to do something extra over and above the existence of non-resistant non-believers who at least do have access, let's say, to a sort of traditional concept of God, right? The way that appealing to the kind of alleged poverty of the situation of people who don't have that traditional theistic concept is that I take it it's supposed to invoke a kind of unfairness between human beings in this lifetime with respect to the opportunity to have relationship with God. And so that's why I think my point is somewhat relevant, at least, about there maybe not being that big of a gulf between those two types of people. So then so if that's right, then it starts to collapse back into just the original point about, well, surely a perfectly loving God would want a really, dynamic two-way relationship with us, like the way we do with each other, which I recognize that has some intuitive force, but yes, that's just the original argument. I don't think, I mean, I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying that not people with people who lack a traditional God concept. I'm not saying that the existence of those people adds nothing to Schellenberg's argument, but I suppose what I'm trying to do by saying that their situation is not that more impoverished than that of the average theistic believer is to say that it doesn't add all that much.
So let me give one more response, and then I'll move on. That insofar as the theist is accepting the first claim of Schellenberg's argument, that if a God exists, he's always open to relationship with everyone, and he's only challenging the second, that if God is open to relationship with everyone, then there's no non-resistant non-belief. If they take this line that one can still be in a kind of relationship with God, even if they don't believe that God exists, you still seem forced to make a rather bold claim that every single case of non-resistant non-belief falls into this implicit theistic belief category. So, and that's where I think, I mean, maybe some people, maybe most people will have this, but like everyone?
Yeah, no, I agree that. And that's so, okay. When you isolate it out like that and say, but this is why I certainly would want to press on both of those things. So for both the idea that God would always hold out the opportunity for personal relationship at every waking moment, and the idea that such relationship can only be had on the basis of an explicit theistic belief. I would want to question both of those things, and I think you're right that to only question the latter is going to leave you with a big problem still.
Okay, good. Well, we agree. So I have a quote here from a Mr. Alex O'Connor. And it's pretty lengthy, but he often appeals to the problem of divine hiddenness, explicitly invoking Schellenberg's sophisticated form of the argument in debates and interviews as a justification for atheism.
Yeah.
And I found his to be very pointed and moving.
I went to Catholic schools. I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well. And in fact, I still do attend such groups. Just recently, I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it again, in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with 2 devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life. I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Jung. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I've looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe.
So, Max, why is God hidden from Alex O'Connor?
I mean, I don't know. I'm sorry to... That's going to sound like a huge cop-out, but I don't know. I really don't. And I do think Alex is very sincere. I know him reasonably well. So I don't think...
Yes.
Basically, in a sense, one has 2 options here. One is to say, well, Alex is insincere and he doesn't really want a relationship with God, and I think that's not a route that I would want to go down. As I said, especially given that I actually know Alex and I have a real sense of his sincerity. And the other is to say that there's some greater good for the sake of which God is currently withholding the sort of experience that Alex talks about. But, and of course, earlier we talked about some different possible greater goods. But I don't think thinking that these greater goods could be the reason why God allows divine hiddenness in general means that one has to take any stance on what's going on in the life of a particular individual. I think it's quite proper to just be agnostic about that.
I think you're right. And I don't know. I mean, I found it so moving the first time I heard that. It was 3 years ago, and he said that in a debate setting, because I personally have witnessed the great good that has come about from Alex O'Connor's intellectual journey and his engagement with these issues. I mean, if nothing else, just one small thing that might not mean anything to anybody except for me, is that I myself began to even explore the option of going to Oxford to get a master's degree in theology and philosophy because Alex got his undergrad there, and I watched his YouTube videos. And his channel inspired me to do the same thing in this case, in this YouTube channel. And so in like so many ways, I have been inspired from Alex's journey, and I can only imagine that that fact has been multiplied so many times over by different people. And I think that who's to say where Alex goes from here and what the contours of his life will be like?
That's really interesting, actually, and I hadn't thought of that angle, but you're right. I mean, so in a sense, you're sort of gesturing towards a possible greater good that we can maybe see the contours of, and yeah, I'm open to that. And I certainly second what you said about the impact his channel has had. And I think it's been a really good impact because I think something people are really struck by wherever they stand on these issues is that he is different from the sort of previous generation of atheists, the new atheists, so-called. Alex seems really different from that. Seems to come with a real kind of respectfulness and a real genuine curiosity, and not a sort of he's not got an axe to grind, as it were. And so I don't doubt that it's his content has impacted people in ways that have probably spurred a lot of people to explore these issues more deeply. In the sort of way that you gave an example of. So who knows? Yeah, maybe that's a possible greater good that is the reason why Alex hasn't yet had that sort of religious experience.
It's possible, and I don't think it would do any good to pretend that we know the actual answer or the reason, or that there is an answer or a reason.
Right.
It's just that I have noticed, I have learned a great deal from him about how to have these conversations and how to do philosophy and philosophy of religion
Yeah.
well. So the last few points I want to explore have to do with different versions of the problem of hiddenness
Yeah.
than the ones we've explored here. I mean, Schellenberg's is a very specific case of, as we've said, a deductive argument which aims to show that God's existence, just by definition, is logically incompatible with any amount of non-resistant non-belief in the
Yeah.
world. That's a very strong
Right.
claim. That's analogous to the logical problem of evil, which is the claim that God's existence is logically incompatible with any evil whatsoever. Most philosophers have moved past that version of the problem, and they focus now on what is a stronger, more subtle form of the issue, the evidential problem of evil, which is to say that even if God's existence is, in an abstract sense, logically compatible with a certain amount of evil, nevertheless, the amounts and magnitude and severity of the evil we observe in the world makes it really improbable
Yeah.
that God exists, even if not impossible, to sound like William Lane Craig here. So I wonder, though, a few of these are distinct enough in form that it warrants like specific comment. One is about the distribution of belief and non-belief in the world, the demographics
Yeah.
of belief and non-belief. I find this quite powerful because there are essentially two implicit premises here. The first is that if theism is true, we ought to expect a fairly uniform distribution of belief in God in the world. And that, however, if atheism or naturalism specifically is true, if religious belief has no real connection to objective reality, but just is a byproduct of culture and social conditioning and evolution ultimately, we ought to expect basically the distribution of religious belief that we do in fact find, where, if nothing else, you're overwhelmingly likely to accept the religious beliefs that you grew up in or to deconvert and become an atheist, rather than growing up in a Hindu culture and becoming an evangelical Christian, which sometimes happens, but rarely. So I find this to be a pretty forceful evidential argument for naturalism. That's like, if we look around the world, this is what we ought to expect if
Yeah.
naturalism is true.
Yeah, okay, so, this is the first paper I published on hiddenness was on this very formulation of the problem of divine hiddenness. So that's if you want to see in more depth what I had to say on this, although that was kind of 9 years ago, that's mutual epistemic dependence and the demographic divine hiddenness problem.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, the first thing to say is sort of a repeat of what we were touching on earlier, that I think that this demographic problem is certainly a very hard problem for versions of theism which are committed to hard exclusivism, right? So in the sense that if people's sort of eternal destiny is dependent on the accuracy of their theological beliefs ante mortem, then the way in which religious belief is distributed throughout space and time, and the fact that it looks like some people have a very meager opportunity to come to have theistic belief, whereas others, it's almost sort of a given that they're going to be theists. That definitely looks like a very hard problem for sort of hard exclusivist versions of theism. For versions of theism that, I mean, and this doesn't just include universalism, although obviously it does include universalism, but for versions of theism that break that link, so there's, for versions of theism that are non-universalist, that say that, like, whatever beliefs a person had in their lifetime, their ultimate opportunity to have salvation is not going to hinge just on factors that were completely outside of their control, the accident of birth and so on. So and universalistic versions as well of theism, that like those, it's a lot less obvious that those sorts of versions suffer from this divine hiddenness problem, of the demographic problem, in a way that in a way that goes significantly above and beyond just the mere fact of non-resistant non-belief, I would suggest.
Okay, you say that last part
Well,
again.
so
Sorry.
if we've already factored in just the very fact that there is non-resistant non-belief in the world is some evidence against theism of any variety, which I think it is some evidence. So, it's a further question about how much. But if we've already put that in the bank, as it were, then the question is, how much further evidence is it against theism that religious belief is distributed in this uneven manner? Then my suggestion is I don't think it's doing very much extra, to at least to those versions of theism that aren't coupling someone's eternal destiny tightly to the beliefs, the theological beliefs they have before death.
Okay, I get what you're saying. Let me kind of circumvent a few issues here and see if I can pin down a question for you. What was the nature of your upbringing, in terms, specifically you, Max, in terms of your religious context?
Yeah, so I suppose kind of liberal Anglican.
Okay. Now, do you think that influenced the religious views you hold today? I mean, obviously, I'm sure you'd say yes, but
Yes, to a degree, I think, but not as directly as for some people. So I had a few years of being completely non-religious, and so then I sort of came to Christianity as an adult, and somewhat with a yeah. I mean, I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate, and I seriously considered naturalism as well as Christianity as options. So yeah, I mean, of course, you could say, well, it sounds like Hinduism and Islam weren't very live options, and that's true, and I don't doubt that is in part due to the circumstances of where I was brought up and that kind of thing.
But I guess what I question is that even if we've granted universalism or something like it, we still have this case about the pretty profound and somewhat embarrassing tie between one's geographical origin and the content of their religious beliefs. I think we can at least say that naturalism would lead us to expect that kind of distribution, with enough background information filled in to make that concrete prediction. Now, even if we then say that, well, okay, but then we just have no idea what theism would lead us to predict, it still sticks with me that it's like, yeah, but this is still what naturalism would lead us to think the world would look like. That there'd be this really tight connection.
I mean, I suppose that's tricky as well, because, naturalism plus a lot of naturalism that has helped itself to a lot of other stuff above and beyond the bare naturalistic hypothesis that reality is at bottom impersonal, valueless, etc. So this is where I think there is an issue in the sort of natural theology debate in general, when I think naturalism often wants to just help itself to, well, whatever our best sciences say is the case about human nature and the universe, that's what naturalism would predict, and I think that's often a little bit too quick. Yeah, so I mean, it depends. It's going to depend a lot what you've built into background knowledge in order to get that claim to work, namely that naturalism would lead us to expect a situation in which humans have religious beliefs that kind of correlate with the culture in which they've grown up. Because I mean, is it obvious that naturalism would expect us would lead us to expect there to be humans with our kind of consciousness that are capable of having religious beliefs at all? I mean, that we don't have to get into that, but you see what I'm saying? I think we should be a little careful about just immediately granting that claim.
Okay. Well, in the interest of time, I have one more question to ask you pertaining to these issues, and that is what I understand to be the problem of religious disagreement which is a more specific issue than what we've been talking
Right.
about, that people in general across the world profoundly disagree about the nature of ultimate reality. And yet they all seem, well, not all of them, but many of them seem quite sincere in their beliefs, and they engage in similar practices like prayer and meditation and going to church or some kind of worship of some kind or another. And yet they all come to very different conclusions about what ultimate reality looks like. It just isn't the case that at base all world religions are the same. And so if we think of like an analogy that I'm just coming up with off the top of my head, of there being an object in the middle of the room, and 20 people come into this room, they observe the object, and then they exit the room, and someone goes through and records each person's account of what they saw. And let's say we get 20 stellarly contradictory accounts, distinct accounts of what the object was in that room. Now let's say you're one of the 20 people and you find out this fact about pronounced disagreement. Should you think that you're having veridical experiences of the object in the middle of the room? Or should you think, I don't know what's happening here, but it's likely that my perceptions of this thing are way off too, just like the other 20?
Yeah, you should think that.
Have I got you? Have I put you in a corner,
No,
Max?
no.
Refutation.
Well, so firstly, you should think the latter thing. But secondly, I don't think the analogy is that close an analogy. And let me say why. So firstly, like if religious experience was our only way of gaining evidence about religious truth, let's say, and the different experiences people had were as contradictory as in your analogy, then yes, that is the situation we'd be in. But I don't think that is quite the situation. So it seems like religious experience is, I would see it more as kind of supplementary to like the major religions agree on a certain amount, at least like the Abrahamic religions agree quite largely in terms of the attributes of God. And even Hinduism, as I've come to learn, is often, I think Westerners often think it's pantheistic, but apparently that's actually largely not the case. It's much more theistic, really. So it looks like a large majority of the world's population believes in a being with largely overlapping attributes. Sure, some differences, and then it looks like the differences are with respect to historical alleged revelations of that being. And I think, maybe it's not kind of politically correct to say this, but I just don't think, though, the evidence is on a par for the historical alleged revelations that the different major world religions claim. Now, that obviously that would probably be another whole podcast, but so I do think, when it comes to weighing up the central claims of Christianity about Jesus, mainstream historical Jesus scholarship now, even the more skeptical people like Ehrman, will grant that the basic shape, the broad shape of Jesus' life is basically what the Gospels present us with. Sure, he's going to quibble over lots of details, but that's just not really the case with the central figures of other major world religions from a historical point of view. And so, again, if it was the case that all of the things Christians believe about Jesus are supposed to have been mediated just through private religious experience, which then conflicts with things that Hindus believe about Krishna or whatever, then that would be like your analogy, but I don't think that is the actual situation.
I think that's a good response. Do you think, though, that to play devil's advocate for this argument, do you think that one could still raise an argument against the veridicality or reliability of religious experience as a means for delivering more detailed religious doctrine?
Yes.
So,
yes, I do. No, I absolutely do. And this is why I don't think that, as I said, I use the word supplementary. I guess that is, I appreciate other people will have a religious, an epistemology of religious belief that puts religious experience much more in the center. But I mean, in a sense, for roughly the reasons you've sketched, I don't. I think it does need to be more supplementary. Like, I think religious experience, when you take the wide sweep of human religious experience as data, I think it might get you to that there is some sort of transcendent reality, but I don't see that one could get much more detail out of it than that, because of the diverse contents sort of objection.
Well, good. Thank you so much, Max, for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure talking to you. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Miles.